We all kind of just accept it, right?
Yeah.
Homework, it's got to be good for kids' grades. It's like obvious. But what if it's not that simple? What if that connection, between homework and how well kids do in school is way more complicated than we think? Welcome to the deep dive. We take those things you think you know, and, well, we dive deep. And today, it's all about homework. You guys asked for it. You want to know what the research really says, not just like opinions, right? So we're digging into the real deal,
Yeah, it's a question I hear all the time. And for good reason, it's a big deal for parents, teachers, everybody.
for sure. And we found this amazing research article, a whole review of tons of studies on this exact topic. It
Yeah.
covers like the whole 20th century, even beyond. It's called The Relationship Between Homework and Achievement, Still Much of a Mystery.
Oh, yeah, I know that one. By Ulrich Trautwein and Olaf Kuller. It was published in 2003 in the Educational Psychology Review. It's a dense one, but super thorough.
Exactly. It's not just someone's blog post. It's serious academic stuff.
And that's what we're all about here, getting into the nitty-gritty.
So that's our mission today, to figure out what this research actually tells us about homework and grades, how they're connected or maybe not connected, and, the challenges of really studying this whole thing. By the end, you'll have a much clearer picture.
You'll be the homework know-it-all at your next PTA meeting.
Haha, maybe. So the review starts by pointing out that people have been arguing about homework forever. They mention studies from 2001 by Cooper and Valentine, and even older ones, Gill and Schlossman back in '96. It's not a new debate at all.
Nope, not at all. But it really heated up, like in the late 90s. Remember those big international studies? TIMSS, the third International Mathematics and Science Study. Those results came out in 96 for middle school, then 98 for high school.
Oh, right. And everyone was freaking out because countries like Japan and South Korea were blowing us out of the water in math and science.
Exactly. And there was this idea that those students were spending way more time studying outside of school, the whole tiger mom stereotype. Wahlberg and Pascal did a bunch of work on this back in 95, and Cooper had some research in 99 too, all pointing to these differences in study habits.
And of course, that led to a whole push for more homework here. Like, if we just make our kids study more, they'll magically catch up.
Right. Like it was the simple solution. A bunch of scientists were on board with that, like Betts, Wahlberg. Even politicians got involved. I think it was David Blunkett in the UK who was pushing for more and like different kinds of homework.
What does that even mean?
Well, it could be anything from more project-based stuff to like mandatory study halls after school. The idea was to get kids spending more time focused on academics outside of class. But of course, not everyone agreed that more homework was the answer.
Right. There was a whole other side saying, hold on, let's look at the actual evidence here.
Yeah, people like Pallardy in 95 started pointing out that a lot of the studies on homework had some serious flaws. Like, they weren't designed well enough to really prove that homework was causing the better grades.
And then you had studies like the one by Farrow and his colleagues, I think it was in '99, that actually didn't find a positive relationship between homework and achievement, like at all. Even Time magazine was questioning if we were overdoing it with homework,
It was a whole mess, really.
which is why this review is so important. It's not about taking sides. It's about really analyzing the research itself, the methods, the theories behind it all to figure out why it's so hard to get a straight answer on the value of homework.
Exactly. It's all about being informed.
So, to be clear, they start by defining exactly what they mean by homework. They're using Cooper's definition from 1989, which is tasks assigned to students by school teachers that are meant to be carried out during non-school hours.
Okay, so it's specifically about stuff teachers give kids to do outside of school.
Right. Not just any learning that happens outside of school. They specifically exclude things like private tutoring, like those Juku cram schools in Japan,
Yeah.
or even just a kid reading for fun or practicing piano.
Yeah, that's an important distinction because those other activities definitely contribute to a kid's overall learning. They even mention that, citing Wahlberg and Pascal's work. But for this review, they're only looking at teacher-assigned work.
And the reason is that's the thing teachers have the most control over.
Right.
They can decide how much to give, what kind, all that. They can't really control if a kid has a tutor or how much TV they watch.
Makes sense. So we're talking about a very specific type of learning activity, teacher-driven, outside of school hours.
Right. So with that definition in place, they take us through a whole journey of homework research, starting with Cooper's own review back in '89. He looked at all the studies done before '87 and divided them into two main types. Experimental studies, where they actually compare kids who get homework to those who don't, and correlational studies, where they just look at the relationship between time spent on homework and achievement.
Classic research methods, gotta love it.
So what did they find? Let's start with the experimental studies.
Okay, so Cooper did a meta-analysis of 17 of these studies from 62 to 87, and overall he found a positive effect of homework on achievement. But it's important to note, the effect size was pretty small, like 0.21.
0.21. That doesn't sound like a huge impact.
No, not huge, but it does suggest that on average, kids who had homework did a little bit better than those who didn't.
Okay, but was that across the board, like for all ages and subjects?
That's where it gets interesting. The effect was much stronger for high schoolers, grades 10 to 12. There, the effect size jumped up to 0.64. But for younger kids, elementary school, the effect was much weaker. And it was also weaker for math specifically, only like 0.16.
Huh. That's weird. You'd think math would be where homework helps the most.
You would, right. But there were a few other things that stood out too. For one, the positive effect was way bigger, like 3 times bigger, when it was the teachers themselves who were doing the research.
Okay, so maybe teachers are just better at figuring out what kind of homework actually works.
Maybe. Or maybe there's some bias there. Teachers who believe in homework might design studies that are more likely to show positive results.
Interesting. What else?
Well, another thing was that only the less rigorous studies showed positive effects. The ones that didn't use things like counterbalancing or repeated measures. When they did use those more sophisticated designs, the effect actually became negative, like Medigo 0.08.
So it's like the more carefully they tried to study it, the less homework seemed to matter.
Kind of, yeah. It makes you wonder about those initial positive findings. And it's important to remember that not everyone agreed with Cooper's conclusions, even back then.
Oh, right. Other researchers were already pointing out the flaws in those early studies.
Exactly. Coulter, Harding, Nilshan, Rickards. They all argued that the evidence for a strong positive effect of homework was pretty flimsy. They said a lot of those studies lacked proper randomization, so the groups weren't really comparable to begin with, and they didn't control for other variables well enough, like pre-existing differences between the kids.
Right. If the kids who got homework were already higher achievers, you can't really say it was the homework that made them do better.
Exactly. Plus, they mentioned other limitations, like short study durations, small sample sizes, and a really big one, they often use the wrong unit of analysis. Like, they'd analyze the data at the individual student level, but the homework intervention was actually at the classroom level.
Right. It's like if you want to see if a new fertilizer makes trees grow taller, you can't just measure a few random trees. You have to look at the whole forest.
Exactly. The trees are all growing in the same environment, so you can't treat them as totally independent.
Okay, so the experimental evidence was kind of shaky. What about the correlational studies? The ones that just looked at time spent on homework and how that relates to grades?
Well, those painted a slightly rosier picture for homework fans. Cooper's review found that most of those studies did show a positive association. Out of 50 correlations they examined, 17 showed at least one positive link.
Okay, so more often than not, more homework seemed to go along with better grades.
In those studies, yeah. But again, it wasn't simple. The strength of the correlations varied a lot. And just like in the experimental studies, there was an age effect. The link between time and achievement was weak in elementary school and got stronger as kids got older.
Okay, so maybe homework just becomes more important in high school.
Maybe. Though, interestingly, the strongest correlations in these studies were in math, which is the opposite of what we saw in the experimental studies.
That is super weird. Why would those results flip like that?
It's one of the big mysteries. But the review also brings up a really fundamental problem with correlational studies. You can't be sure which way the cause and effect goes. Does doing more homework lead to better grades? Or do teachers just give more homework to kids who are already doing well? It's impossible to tell just from those kinds of studies.
It's the chicken or the egg problem all over again.
Exactly. And Cooper did look at some studies that tried to control for other factors like IQ, motivation, socioeconomic status. Even after accounting for those things, the general trend was still positive.
Okay, so that suggests maybe homework does play a role.
Maybe. But then there's all the work by Keith and his colleagues, which kind of throws a wrench in things.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about their studies. They were doing some pretty advanced analysis, right?
Yeah, they were using these big national data sets and really sophisticated statistical methods like path analysis and structural equation modeling. This allowed them to tease apart different possible pathways of influence.
So they could see if it was actually the homework that was leading to better grades or if something else was going on.
Exactly. And in a 1988 study, Keith reanalyzed data from this huge survey called High School and Beyond. He found a small but statistically significant direct effect of study time on achievement test scores.
So there was an effect, but it was small.
Right, not huge, but it was there. But then, in later work with Kuhl, they found something really interesting. They initially found a positive correlation between homework time and achievement, but when they controlled for more variables, things like motivation, ability, teaching quality, how much challenging coursework the kids were taking, all that the effect of homework basically vanished.
Wow. So it was like the kids who were already motivated and taking tougher classes were also the ones doing more homework. It wasn't necessarily the homework itself that was causing the better grades.
Right, it was a correlation but not causation. And they found a strong link between the amount of academic coursework and the time spent on homework, which makes sense. Kids in harder classes are going to have more work to do.
Makes sense. So the context really matters. And then they did that study in '93 where they looked at parental involvement.
Yeah, that one's fascinating. They found that parents being involved seemed to lead to kids spending more time on homework, which then had a positive effect on achievement. But this study didn't control for some of those key variables that they had identified as important before, like the intensity of the coursework.
So again, it's hard to say for sure what's causing what.
Exactly. And that's kind of where the review gets to this point of, okay, there are still a lot of ambiguities here.
Right. They specifically call out two big issues that prevent us from just accepting all the previous findings as fact.
Yep. First, the way they were measuring homework and achievement, those variables. And second, how they were dealing with the fact that the data has this hierarchical structure.
Hierarchical structure. Explain that one to me.
It basically means that you've got different levels of things going on. You've got individual students, right? But they're nested within classrooms, which are nested within schools. So a kid's experience with homework isn't just about them, it's also about their teachers' homework policies and the whole school environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's layers of context.
Right. And the big question is the relationship between homework and achievement mainly a teacher class effect or a student individual effect, or both?
So do kids learn more in classes where the teacher gives more homework? Or do kids who spend more time on homework than their classmates within the same class do better?
Exactly. And a lot of the older research kind of muddled those two things together. Like they'd look at a big correlation across a ton of students without really separating what's happening at the classroom level versus the individual level.
Okay, so you're saying they were missing crucial information by not looking at those different levels separately?
Yeah, they were. They even give an example from a Keith and Page study where they combined a class level factor, like whether the teacher ever assigned homework, with a student level factor, like whether the kid actually did the homework. When you do that, you lose a lot of nuance.
It's like trying to understand traffic patterns in a city by just looking at the speed of individual cars without considering things like road design or rush hour.
Perfect analogy. And the thing is, you could have positive effects happening at both levels, or maybe even opposing effects. Like, imagine a class where the teacher gives a lot of really good homework, so the whole class does better overall. But within that class, the kids who spend the most time on homework might actually be the ones who are struggling, so they don't see as much individual benefit.
Wow, so it could get really complicated really fast. And this was a common problem in the early research.
Oh, yeah. Cooper himself admitted it was a widespread mistake. And the thing is, when you don't account for that non-independence of data, the fact that kids in the same class are all experiencing the same homework policies, you can get biased results. You might miss real effects, or you might think there's a relationship when there isn't. And you can't see how different kids in the same class might be responding to the homework.
Right, because not all kids react the same way to the same amount of homework.
Exactly. And they even cite studies showing that a big chunk of the variation in how much time kids spend on homework can be explained by the specific class or even the school they're in.
So you really can't ignore the context. It's like a kid's experience in a super competitive school is going to be different from a kid in a more laid-back environment, even if they're doing the same amount of homework.
Right. And a lot of those big national surveys, while they were great for some research questions, weren't really designed to tease apart these different levels of influence when it comes to homework. Some researchers tried to fix this by controlling for things like the academic coursework kids were taking.
Like, if you know a kid is in an honors class, you might expect them to have more homework.
Right. But the review argues that those kinds of controls might not be enough. And that's where they introduced the idea of multi-level modeling, which is a much better way to analyze this kind of data.
Multi-level modeling, that sounds Intense.
It's a statistical technique, but it's super useful for dealing with this hierarchical data. It lets you look at both the classroom level and the individual level at the same time, while accounting for the fact that the data isn't independent. It's like a superpower for untangling these messy relationships.
Okay, so that's one big issue, how they were analyzing the data. The second big problem they point out is with the variables themselves, how they were defining and measuring homework and achievement. Let's start with achievement. What were the main issues there?
Well, they point out that there are two main ways researchers have measured achievement: standardized tests and grades. And they argue that when you're trying to look at class level effects, like whether a teacher's homework policy affects a whole class's performance, standardized tests are the better measure.
Why is that? Aren't grades a pretty good indicator of how well kids are doing?
They are, but the problem is that grades are often standardized within a classroom. Like a kid who gets an A in a low achieving class might not get an A in a higher achieving class, even if they have the same level of knowledge. So, grades don't always give you a fair comparison between different classes and therefore different teachers' homework practices.
Oh, right, it's all relative.
Exactly. So, for comparing different classrooms or schools, you need a more objective measure, like a standardized test. But for looking at individual kids within a specific class, grades can be useful.
Okay, so it depends on what question you're asking.
Right. And another important point is that if you want to see how homework contributes to gains in achievement over time, you need longitudinal studies. You need to follow the same kids for a while and see how they progress.
Right, like does doing homework in third grade make you a better student in fourth grade?
Exactly. And unfortunately, some studies used less than ideal measures to try to assess those gains. Instead of using actual scores from previous achievement tests, they used things like IQ scores or even just kids' memories of their past grades.
That seems kind of unreliable.
It is. The review cites research showing that past achievement test scores are a much better predictor of future success than those other measures.
Makes sense. So there are definitely complexities with measuring achievement. What about homework itself? How are they measuring that?
The most common way was just asking kids how much time they spend on homework each week. Like, how many hours do you usually spend on homework?
Seems straightforward enough.
It does, but they point out at least 4 big problems with that measure.
4. Lamb on me.
First, it might not be as clean as we think. If the survey questions aren't super precise, kids might include other stuff when they estimate their time, like studying for a test, working on a long-term project, things that aren't technically homework for the next day.
Yeah, that's true. I remember in high school, I'd often lump all my schoolwork together when I was thinking about how much time I was spending.
Right. And the review suggests that this lack of clarity might be part of the reason why older students sometimes show a stronger link between homework time and achievement, because they're more likely to be doing those other self-directed study activities as well.
Interesting. What's the second problem?
Second, time spent per week is an aggregated measure. It combines two different things: how often the teacher assigns homework, which is more of a class-level variable, and how long the individual kid spends on it each time, which is more student-level. The review argues that we should be looking at those two things separately.
Okay, so it matters when the homework is assigned, not just how much total time is spent. Like a little bit every day might be different from a huge chunk once a week,
Yeah.
even if it adds up to the same number of hours.
Exactly. What's the third problem?
Hit me.
The third problem is that the amount of time a kid spends on homework doesn't always tell you what you think it does about their learning. Like, a kid might spend a lot of time because they're just really struggling with the material, or they might spend a lot of time because they're super diligent and want to get every single problem right.
So a kid who's really gifted, but maybe not that motivated, could be spending the same amount of time as a kid who's working their butt off, but just finding it really hard.
Exactly. You can't assume that more time always equals better understanding.
Okay, that's a good point. And the fourth problem.
The fourth one is about how accurate those self-reported times even are. They cite a study that found a really weak correlation between what kids said and what their parents said about how much homework was being assigned. And even when kids use logbooks to track their time more carefully, it can still be influenced by things like upcoming tests, where they might cram a lot and then overestimate their usual time.
So we can't even be sure those time estimates are actually correct.
Right. It's another layer of uncertainty.
Okay, so we've got a lot of problems here. Hierarchical data, measurement issues, all that. What did the research do to try to address these problems? The review mentions a new generation of homework studies.
Right. And the big thing with those newer studies is that they started using much more sophisticated statistical methods, especially multi-level modeling.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, we talked about it before. It's a way to deal with that hierarchical data structure, to look at both the classroom level and the individual level at the same time. It's like, finally, researchers had the tools to properly analyze this kind of complex data.
So they could start asking more nuanced questions like, do kids in classes with more homework do better as a whole class? And separately, within a specific class, do the kids who do more homework than their classmates do better?
Exactly. And they started finding some really interesting stuff. The review mentions Corno's work in the 80s as being ahead of its time. She was already trying to separate those individual and class effects, even though she didn't have the fancy software we have now.
She was a pioneer.
Totally. And then there's the study by Timms and Fitzgibbon in the UK. They looked at English students and how their out-of-class study time related to their scores on these big exams called A-levels.
Those are like the SATs or ACTs here, right?
Yeah, kind of. Big, important exams. And they controlled for prior achievement and gender, but they found mostly non-significant effects of homework at the classroom level and really small effects at the individual level.
So not a lot of evidence that homework was making a big difference.
Not in that study, no. But they did point out that their measure of homework was pretty broad. It could have included all sorts of self-study.
Right, so it wasn't just teacher-assigned stuff. What about Farrell and his colleagues?
Yeah.
They did that study with a ton of elementary school kids, right?
Yeah, almost 20,000 kids. They were looking at math, reading, and science, and they controlled for a bunch of background variables. But they didn't control for prior achievement. Their main finding was that more homework wasn't necessarily better, especially for younger kids.
So they were kind of pushing back against that more is always better mentality.
Yeah. But there were some limitations to their study, too. They only asked about how often kids did homework, not how much time they spent. And it wasn't clear if kids were reporting on teacher-assigned work or just any work they did.
So again, some measurement issues.
Right. But interestingly, they did find a small but statistically significant positive effect of homework frequency at the class level for math and science.
So teachers who assigned homework more often had slightly higher achieving classes overall.
Yeah, in those subjects. What about this study by de Jong and his colleagues in the Netherlands?
Oh, right. They were the ones who were really careful about measuring homework itself.
Exactly. They focused on math achievement in 7th grade, and they used repeated measures to track kids over time. They also controlled for prior knowledge and intelligence. They collected data on different aspects of homework from the kids, the teachers, and classroom observers.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
It is. And they found a negative correlation between time spent on homework and math achievement, although it wasn't statistically significant once they controlled for prior knowledge.
Negative. Wait, so spending more time meant doing worse.
Well, they interpreted it as maybe the kids who were struggling needed more time to catch up. And the only homework variable that significantly predicted math achievement at the class level was the total amount of work assigned, not how often it was assigned.
So it's about the volume of work, not the frequency.
That's what it seemed like. And then, of course, we have the study by Trautwein and his colleagues, the one this whole review is about.
Right, the German study.
Yep. They looked at 7th graders, and they controlled for a whole bunch of stuff. Prior achievement, intelligence, SES, motivation, school type. They looked at 3 homework variables: frequency, how often teachers checked it, and time spent. At the class level, they found a positive effect of homework frequency on math achievement.
Okay, so more frequent homework seemed to be good for the whole class.
Yeah. But they found a non-significant negative effect of homework length on achievement overall, though that did interact with kids' individual achievement levels.
So maybe for some kids, more homework was actually harmful.
It's possible. And then, get this, at the individual level, they found a statistically significant negative effect of time spent on homework on achievement gains.
Wait, seriously, so the more time kids spent, the worse they did?
That's what they found. It's super counterintuitive. They offered a few explanations. Maybe kids who take longer just work slower, or maybe they're not working as attentively. Or maybe it's a methodological thing because they collected the time data at the end of the year, so maybe kids who were behind were cramming a lot and that skewed the results.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is. But when you look at all these newer studies together, what do you see?
Well, it seems like 3 out of the 4 found a positive effect of something at the classroom level, either frequency or amount of work. But at the individual level, it's much less clear. There's not really strong evidence that more time equals better grades.
Right. And in fact, one study found the opposite. So these better methods are helping us understand classroom level effects, but the individual relationship between time spent and achievement is still a big question mark.
It's not as simple as we thought. And even those newer studies had limitations, right?
Oh, absolutely. They were done in different countries with different systems. A lot of them still only looked at a few homework variables. They didn't really explore how homework might interact with different types of learners. And some of them didn't deal with the problem of attrition, kids dropping out of the study, which can mess with the results.
Right. So we've made progress, but there's still a lot we don't know. Okay, what about studies that look specifically at homework and grades?
The review talks about that too. They point out that grades are important because they affect kids' futures, and they might be more sensitive to things like effort and motivation compared to standardized tests. But they also say that grades aren't a good way to measure the effectiveness of homework policies at the classroom level, because grades are usually based on the standards within that classroom.
Right, we talked about that before.
So the relationship between homework and grades is really something to look at the individual level.
Okay, so within a specific class, do the kids who do more homework get better grades? You'd think so, right?
You would, but it's more complicated than that. Grades aren't just about achievement. They also reflect things like participation, effort, completion of work. Teachers might give a kid a good grade just for doing their homework, even if they didn't really understand it.
So it's about being responsible and following through, not just about learning the material.
Right. And to really figure out how homework affects grades, you need really good studies. Studies that control for the classroom context, that follow kids over time, that look at more than just time spent, that account for other factors like behavior and ability. The review says that at the time, there weren't any studies that really did all that.
So even the relationship between homework and grades is a mystery, which brings us back to the big question. Does homework actually work? Does it really make kids better students?
And the answer, frustratingly, is we still don't know for sure. The research just isn't clear. There's been progress for sure with bigger studies and better methods, but the basic question of whether homework really leads to higher achievement is still up in the air. The individual level relationship is unclear, the impact on grades is unclear, and we don't really know how homework affects different types of learners.
It's a lot more complicated than just homework good or homework bad.
Way more
Yeah.
complicated. And the review argues that part of the problem is that a lot of the research has been done using data sets that weren't designed for studying homework specifically.
So they were trying to answer questions that the data wasn't really equipped to answer.
That's right. They're saying we need better studies that are based on real learning theories and that use measures that actually capture what's going on with homework.
So let's talk about some of those learning theories. The first one they mention is time on task, which seems pretty obvious.
Yeah, the basic argument is that homework increases the total amount of time kids spend learning, and that leads to better achievement. Carroll's school learning model is a big one here. It basically says that achievement equals time spent learning divided by time needed to learn.
Okay, so if a kid needs more time to learn something, homework gives them that extra time.
Right, it can be a way for kids who are struggling to catch up. But the review points out that just measuring time spent on homework doesn't mean that's the actual time needed, according to Carroll's model, and that it doesn't guarantee that the learning is actually happening, especially without a teacher there to guide them.
Right, just because a kid is sitting there with their homework open doesn't mean they're actually learning.
Exactly. And Carroll also talks about perseverance, which is the amount of time a kid is really focused and engaged, not just the total time they have the homework out. And of course, the quality of instruction they're getting at home is probably different from what they get in school.
So more homework isn't always better. It depends on how that time is being used.
Exactly. The second theory they talk about is self-regulation theory, which is all about how kids manage their own learning, and expectancy value theory, which looks at kids' beliefs about their ability to succeed and how much they value the task.
So it's not just about the amount of homework, it's also about the kid's attitude towards